So this is Church History 101. Today we will be looking at the early church from 100 to 200 AD. We call this the patristic era, or the era of the early church fathers. I started the last session with this. I'm going to start with this one again. For those of you who were here last week, it's going to be a bit repetitive. Just in the first 5 or so minutes, we're just going to speed run through what we went in the first session, just to kind of refresh our minds about what we talked about, as I said before. So, the story of the church cannot be reduced to any single denomination or creed. Rather, church history belongs to all those who profess that Jesus Christ is the Lord, who believe in the gospel, and who believe in the legacy of believers that has continued for 2,000 years. When we study church history, we are not coldly studying factual history. Rather, we are learning about the men and women who have gone before us, our spiritual brothers and sisters who have bravely kept the faith, many unto martyrdom. We will learn of the many victories of Christianity and, unfortunately, its many defeats. My hope is that as we discuss church history, we will not only see it as a story of the religious institution of the church, but as the story of God's redemptive action on earth, as the church is, after all, first and foremost, the bride of Christ, and his chosen instrument to spread his gospel to every tribe, tongue, and nation. Amen. We're going to run through this. So the early church, the first century ended with the death of John the Apostle, begins with the same. This run around, we will talk about Irenaeus of Lyon. We will talk about Ignatius. We talked about the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is the second Jewish revolt that saw the complete destruction of of Jerusalem, and also saw Jews completely banned from the city of Jerusalem. We will talk about Marcion this session. We're going to talk about Polycarp. We're going to talk about Clement of Alexandria. We're going to talk about Justin Martyr. We're going to talk about the Antonine Plague, which is the first major plague that the Romans encounter after Christianity is born, and one of the major areas where Christians really showed their character. We're going to talk about Tatian. We're going to talk about Theophilus. We talked about the year of the 5 emperors briefly. Effectively, the Emperor Commodus is executed by his guard in 192, and in the year that followed, 5 emperors would attempt to claim the throne, and Septimius Severus would be the one to win out and kill all the others, basically. We are going to talk about the Muratorian fragment a bit today, I believe. Very quickly, the list of emperors in the 2nd century are Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, Marcus Aurelius, Lucius Verus, Commodus, Pertinax, Didius, and Septimius Severus. To be fair, I don't think I'd want to be an emperor named Didius, but that's just my opinion. That is very, very quickly a run-through of the 2nd century. We are going to slow down and talk about a lot of this in detail, but it's more to give us a grand view of what the early church was going through and what the major issues were. And we'll just jump through this. This is it's not a very good map, but it's one of the better ones I could find. This is a map of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century. In the 2nd century, the Roman Empire had achieved the height of its power. It reached the farthest it would ever reach. You would see the northern parts would reach all the way up to Hadrian's Wall, almost to Scotland in the north, all of Spain, North Africa, Morocco, Egypt. You see what would be Israel here. You have Jordan, Saudi Arabia here, all the way here, I believe, to the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, to what used to be Babylon. You have here what is now Turkey. You have up into here, you have what is now today Georgia, Armenia, all the way up to what would almost be modern-day Russia. You have Greece, what is the Balkans here. You have Switzerland, France, and Italy. This is the largest the Roman Empire would ever be. From that point on, it would start to shrink. But this is the empire that if you were talking to a 2nd century Christian, this is what they would have thought of. And we have here the Mediterranean. We talked about this last week. By this point in time, the Romans regarded as, they called it Mare Nostra, or our sea. because they controlled all of it. They were the dominant power in the world at that time. We talked a little bit about the Greco-Roman world, where with Hellenization. Hellenization, for those of you who remember, Hellenistic culture is Greek culture. Hellenization is starting in the 8th century, moving on to the 8th century BC, which is before Christ, to the 1st century AD. Does anybody, sorry, one brief point. Does anybody know what AD stands for? It does not. I always thought that. For some reason, people always told me, oh, it's after death. It doesn't mean that. It means Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. So I felt like an idiot, and now I can... So anyways, Hellenization is the spread of Greek culture, art, and lifestyle and language from ancient Greece outwards. It would extend to much of the Mediterranean, and Alexander the Great, who was king of Macedonia and a Greek in the 3rd century before Christ, would conquer the entire Babylonian Persian Empire. In doing so, he would expand and he would build 70 cities that would spread this Greek culture across the Middle East. This is what we call today Hellenization, where you now had widespread Greek migration, widespread acceptance of Greek culture, a universal Greek economy, the spread of Greek language to the point where our entire New Testament was originally written in Koine Greek, not in Hebrew, not in Aramaic, not in Latin, but in Greek. You had the spread of Greek ideas. You had the spread of the value of language, and Greek religion expanded rapidly. Hellenization would play a massive role in the early church because, as I said, the early church wrote in Greek. The early church fathers, the church leaders, they thought Greek, they spoke Greek. They were all intents and purposes Greek, and yet many of them had never been to Greece or were not even born there. So much so to the point where half of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century would speak Greek, the other half would speak Latin. This would play a significant role in the councils that would take place in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, because you would have church leaders who spoke Greek and you would have church leaders who spoke Latin, and the language difference would cause more division than theological issues would actually. It's to the point where Hellenization actually still impacts us today, because who here knows what the Eastern Orthodox Church is? Anybody? They are the dominant church in Greece, Turkey, the Middle East today, Egypt, pretty much anywhere east of Italy would be Eastern Orthodox. They would claim to be the original church, and that the Roman Catholic Church is actually divided from them. They speak primarily Greek, and they think primarily Greek. This is an example of Hellenization. So if we jump back for a second, this will take a moment more than I expected. If we cut a line pretty much right here, this entire half of the empire spoke Greek. This entire half of the empire spoke Latin. In the 4th century, the empire would split pretty much exactly down that line. This is because this was dominantly Greek culture. This was dominantly Latin culture. And so most Eastern Orthodox churches are from this point. If you go to Israel today, you will see a lot of Eastern Orthodox churches. Ukrainian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, they are all branches of this. The main difference is the West, we think very legally. I made the point last week, we like our systematic theology textbooks. We like to define terms. Like to define what our theology is. An example I used last week was the Calvinist-Arminian debate. We all know what that is. Of the two different views on free will and predestination. In the West, this is a really big deal. I'm not weighing in on the situation. In the East, they don't care. That is not on their they don't care about that debate. For them, they're much more willing to give over to divine mystery. They're willing to say that we don't know if you are predestined or if you have free will. They don't really care. they're very okay to say that is not our job to define that. So, does that make sense? More or less, a little bit. That's a very quick run through. I'm trying to be as quick as I can. We talked a little bit last week about Banias Falls. If any of you remember that, this is a picture of the grotto there. It is, if you see the holes here in the wall, this is a Greek pagan cult site. You would see here where statues used to be would be right here, and I believe right here as well. If you guys can all see that, more or less a little bit. Okay. The whole wall is filled with these. This is an example of Hellenization because you now had Greek religion in northern Israel. This is also on the northern tip of Israel today. So now you have Greek religion appearing in northern Israel where historically it would never have been. Another example of Hellenization is amphitheaters, the arts. They love the theater and the arts. And so as a result, this is in the Jordan Valley in Israel. All of my pictures are from Israel. I haven't had an opportunity to go anywhere else. But you would never have seen this before the Greeks came and conquered Israel. You would have never seen this before that. And this is a very tangible way of realizing, of seeing how Greek culture has affected areas outside of Greece. Roman power, we talked a very quick bit about how Rome came to power by the 1st century. They ruled the entire Mediterranean, including southern France, Spain, North Italy, North Africa, and much, much more. We talked about how the Romans were they were ordered, but they were brutal. They believed that if you did not have the power to save yourself, you did not have the right to live. We saw this in the fact that they believed that in the law of exposure, which if you have a newborn that you don't want, you are fully legally allowed to leave it to die in the wilderness, and it would be there would be no one who would object. Another example is the fact that the male head of the household had absolute authority over his household. If he so decided, he could sell his own children into slavery or kill them with no oversight. No judge would intervene. No one. This is the world that Christianity was born into. The earliest accounts of Christianity shows that they worked to right some of these wrongs. They were known for going out and burying the poor dead. Many of the slaves and the dead who couldn't afford to be buried were simply heaped onto a garbage dump and allowed to rot. They were known for rescuing those abandoned infants, and they were known for, even during the most terrible plagues, going out and caring for the sick, even at the cost of their own lives. Christianity offered mercy in a merciless world and has fundamentally altered the direction of human history as a result. We're just kind of speed run through a few of these. We talked about 2nd century Roman religion, paganism. They didn't believe in one god. They had a whole host of gods. We talked about Roman philosophy. I'll just run quickly. Plato, most of early theology used Plato. We talked about Aristotle, Epicurus, Pythagoras, Cynics, and the Stoics. Sorry. I realize I'm taking a little more time than I want, and that's... So we talked about the church fathers. They were the early church bishops and leaders and thinkers of the church, and their writings have one of the easiest ways we can see what the early church thought. Based off of their writings, if we had none of the early church manuscripts, we could recreate 95% of the New Testament purely off of what they wrote. When we talk about the early church, how do we look at the early church? And this, I will slow down a moment on this. Firstly, because I touch a little bit on some of this, when we read the early church fathers, when we look at the practices of the early church, it's important that we do not assume uniformity of Christian practice or belief across the world. Namely, if one church is practicing something, we should not assume that the entire church around the world is doing that same thing. We do not assume that a practice or belief that is mentioned by an early church father is new the first time it is mentioned. It's very likely that if a church father is writing about it, it has been practiced by it for a significant period of time. We do not assume that the writings of the early church is raw information. An example of this would be, we do not assume, the early church fathers are not writing for us. They're not writing their letters, their treatises. They're not writing for us. They're writing to convey a message in their time. For an example, we talk about, or eventually we will talk about Eusebius, who was a historian who wrote a church history in the 4th century. He writes in a way that paints the Emperor Constantine, who legalized Christianity, in a very, very favorable light. He then paints the entire history prior to Constantine in a very dark light. This is to show that he wanted to show that Christianity had gone through a dark age and under the reign of Constantine was coming into the light. That Constantine had been given divine ability by God to bring to the church into a new age. That was his goal. And so we have to read his writings with a grain of salt, with a little bit of understanding of what he's talking about. Lastly, we do not assume that the ancient Christians were any less intelligent or enlightened than modern people. Many of these writers, as modernists, as modern writers, as Westerners, we like to look on a lot of past writers as saying they were less intelligent, less educated. They didn't have the technology that we have, therefore they were handicapped in a way. We need to reject that. We need to recognize that these were men who were intelligent, they were learned, and they had a conviction and a drive that I would wager that few of us could match. That is how we should approach these who are effectively our brothers in Christ. Lastly, we do not assume that anyone in the text looks like us. I meant the point in terms of, say, race. In the ancient Roman world, race was not an issue, based on the fact that we know this because we don't know what the races of any of the early church fathers were because they didn't care to write it down. We also make the point that for many of the early church fathers, or at the very least some, did own slaves. We need to recognize that this was not the same as the American slave trade in the ancient Roman world. Slavery was simply a part of life. That doesn't justify it. We would hope that their Christian convictions would keep them from, would cause them to rethink having slaves. However, that is simply the world that they were in. I made the point that you could it's very likely that early Christians could justify slavery to a degree by saying that we could ensure that these slaves would be treated properly and fairly. In a time when, as a slave, you could be sexually abused, you could be punished, you could be put to death, you could have all manner of injustices dealt against you, and the society you were in would not care one whit. If a Roman master decided one day to kill his slave and crucify him, his Roman fellows, his Roman countrymen, would say there's no problem with that. That is a possibility. We need to come to grips that if we read church history, many of the Christians throughout history are not going to share the convictions that we ourselves would share today. And that is simply a reality if we are to read church history honestly. We ended off with persecution of the church we ended off with the persecution of the church. I made the point that, contrary to popular belief, the Christians of the early first centuries were not constantly persecuted. Rather, persecution was more so regional and would come in bursts, usually depending on which emperor was in power. Also, contrary to what most people believe, Christians were not persecuted for their belief in Jesus Christ, nor was it for claiming that their religion was true. Rather, the crime of the Christians was that, in the Romans' eyes, was obstinacy, or what the Romans called contumacia. This is effectively contempt for Roman law. The whole idea was it didn't matter to the Romans if Christianity was true. It didn't matter to the Romans if Jesus was God or not. They really didn't care. And we will talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But the main issue was actually that the Romans had decided that Christianity did not fit with Roman culture, and so they made it illegal. Therefore, for the Romans, in their eyes, for Christians to continue to be Christians, you are challenging Roman law and Roman order and Roman society. And for that very reason, we have the right to kill you. For the Romans, they loved order. They loved law. They loved their rule. if there was anything that challenged that, they were very quick to deal out judgment in the most brutal fashion they could. And so that brings us up to, that ended off the first session. I apologize, that took a minute more than I want you, but we're still fairly on track. Hopefully that gives you guys a bit of an idea of what we talked about last time. I was going to make the point, I did manage to record and upload last week's session onto YouTube. You can find it under Keystone Ministries if you want a more in-depth look at what we discussed. So let's jump right in. We're going to start off by talking about Pliny and Trajan. So Pliny was the governor, was a Roman governor in a province of Asia Minor. This is what is now Turkey. And so Pliny has a problem. He has found Christians in his region, and he has made an investigation of these Christians. He has determined what they believe, and he has dealt with them in the way that he believes that the Romans, that based off of what Nero had put down in his first persecution of the Christians in 64 to 68 AD. The Emperor Nero was the first emperor to persecute Christians. He kind of set the precedent of how should Romans regard Christianity. Pliny took that and ran with it. So effectively what he did is he sought out the Christians, tortured them, determined what they believed, and then he executed them. And he's feeling somewhat confused, somewhat conflicted, and he writes to Trajan in a series of letters to try to understand if what he did was appropriate, if Trajan would inform him or advise him to do differently. And so that is what we talk when we talk about Pliny and Trajan. This is the first official Roman policy regarding what to do with Christians. This comes from the 2nd century, around 112 AD. From Pliny, a Roman governor in the northern part of modern Turkey, what was then known as Asia Minor. Prior to this, which is Pliny writing to Trajan, the policy of executing discovered Christians was a carryover from Nero's persecution and Domitian's persecution. Domitian was the second emperor in the 1st century to persecute Christians. Their whole thing is, if we find Christians, we execute them, but we will not seek them out. This is a policy that Pliny carried over. In their writings, Pliny explained what he had done in the past and asked Trajan what the further steps should be. So he effectively said, I have discovered Christians, I investigated them, and I have executed them. And he's writing to Trajan to ask, what on earth should I do now? Their writings effectively boil down to 3 points. His first is, should Christians be punished simply for their faith, or are there actual or supposed crimes that they are committing? His whole thing was, if Christians should not be actively sought out, what crime are we accusing them of? If they're actual criminals, we should seek them out. But if they're not, if we shouldn't be seeking them out, then how can they actually be criminals? His second point is how much effort should be put into the investigation. And his third point is what punishments should be inflicted, and should there be allowances for age and physical condition. And so, for the first point, Trajan, I'll quickly, there's actually a fourth point. Yeah. Lastly, does recantation if you discover a Christian and he denies Christ in front of a Roman judge, does that mean the individual is free to go? In response, Trajan approved of what Pliny had already done. He did not address the first question, which is, should Christians be punished for their faith? This would be a point that Christian thinkers in the 2nd century would exploit, basically making the same point I did, where if Christians aren't investigated, why are we criminals? If we are criminals, we should be investigated. Secondly, as to the second, he told Pliny not to seek out Christians, but if an accusation is made, to prosecute them. To the third, any Christian who is brought to court should be punished, except if they recant. If they deny Christ, they are to be given a full pardon. But if there is any Christian who is brought before the judge and does not deny Christ, they are to be executed. This decision by Trajan, this policy of how to deal with Christians, would be the basis for how the Roman Empire would deal with Christians for the next 2 centuries. Later, the apologist Tertullian criticizes the policy, arguing that if Christians were so terrible to earn execution, why were they not sought out?